to order between the City Council and the Planning Commission. If we could have a roll call, please.
Councilmember Francisco. Hart. Vasquez.
Here.
Murillo.
Here.
Rouse.
Here.
White. Mayor Snyder.
Here.
Commissioner Peugeot. Campanella.
Here.
Higgins.
Here.
Jordan.
Here.
Lodge.
Here.
Schwartz.
Here.
Thompson.
Here.
Great, thank you. We're going to call for public comment. I have one public comment speaker slip here, and I believe, Mr. Winnick, that's based on something on the agenda. Is that right? Okay. No need. So you can speak. But did you want to speak at public comment, or so, Mr. Winnick and then Mr. Moldaver? Go right ahead. Is that mic on? Is there a green light?
And I should know that. As I sit on HLC, we're pressing the green button all the time. So again, thank you, Mayor Schneider, council members and commissioners. And I would normally speak to the topics at the time when they come up, but I unfortunately have meetings this morning that I wasn't able to reschedule. So I'm here really wearing two hats. I'm the vice chair of the HLC, and I'm also the president of the AIA Santa Barbara chapter. And first I'll just talk to this issue of HLC, and that is on your agenda. And also I came because of the other members of the board or the commission, but also at great urging from Judy Arias, and I know you all have seen correspondences from her, and actually she was very appreciative that you very quickly responded back, and she also heard back from Paul Casey regarding the historic element, which is what the issue is all about. And oh, sorry, and I also have a cold. So the historic element, which we've all been so excited about, it was passed back in 2012, and I think what sort of hit us and we realized is we're greatly successful, and it's posted on the city website that the historic element is in place and passed. But what we then realized is it needs to be implemented, and so that's why I'm here today, is to really advocate for the implementation of the element, not just the adoption of it. It's just a great baseline to work from. And one of the things that Commissioner Reyes pointed out to me, and I agree with her, is that not only is it about our the beautiful environment that we have in Santa Barbara between the just natural environment as well as our built historic environment, but it also affects the economics of the city. One of the attractions to Santa Barbara is this historic quality and what makes it unique. So by implementing this thing will actually help bolster the economic development in the community. So anyway, enough on that. And I just want to thank and just acknowledge something that's happened from the AIA. We've been really promoting a partnership with the community development director and the whole department, and with the introduction of George Buell and Andrew Stoffler. It's been, and I probably said the names wrong, it's been really great. We were invited to have one of our members of our executive board join the hiring when the building official was part of that job search, and that was just really amazing. So I just want to commend all the community for involving us and allowing us to help out. And just so you know, we had a recent retreat at the AA, and we really have identified how can we help with the built environment and to be an asset. So please, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be looking for ways that we can help. Support your efforts. So thank you.
Thank you for your work on HLC, and I know we'll be talking about the historic element later this morning.
Great, and we'll be looking at the tapes now. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. Mr. Moldaver?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council, members of the commission, members of the planning staff. I'm Lee Moldaver on behalf of the Citizens Planning Association. Thanking you for holding these meetings. And as we can see, Dr. Gebhardt's smiling face over by the door, it gives me great pleasure as well as sadness to let you know that in today's Independent, you may have already seen it online, there's a wonderful profile and tribute to our past president, Louise Boucher, who spent so many hours with council and commissioners and staff in this room, just as with Mr. Winnick, fighting for quality of life and more beautiful, gracious design that makes this community so special. So we were hoping that this tribute to Louise would have appeared earlier, but it's in the new issue of The Independent, and I hope that her spirit is here guiding you in today's work session because she respected and admired what you do so very much.
Anyone else for public comment? Okay, seeing none, I will close public comment and bring it over to Ms. Weiss. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mayor Schneider, council members, and planning commissioners. It was Louise Boucher who helped me get my first city job doing the sign survey. And I want to thank you all for your leadership in the community and with the City of Santa Barbara organization. I want to thank you for your support of the Planning Division staff and all the board and commissions serving the community with our focus on planning. These meetings, which we've held now for many, many years together, are extremely helpful to share the information of what's going on in our workplace, in your political lives, and throughout the community. We learn and we move forward based on the discussions at these meetings towards implementing city goals and general plan goals specifically. There are many approaches and different needs and desires to implement these important city goals and policies, and you heard some interest today about specifically the historic element. So doing studies and assessments and our adaptive management tool, all of those things are really helpful for policy context setting and implementation. I want you to know, as you already do, that you have excellent staff in the Planning Division, in the Community Development Department, in the city's land development team, and throughout the organization. And I am honored to be part of that, all these staff teams. And as you all know, I'll be leaving the city very soon. Next Wednesday. I'm honored to be part of the city's team, and leaving is a huge change in my life. And it's particularly, I'm feeling it a lot at this meeting, because as I've been working with the staff and preparing for this meeting, I'm emphasizing so much about how important it is for moving forward. And since I'm not going to be part of the moving forward yet, I really wanted to be part of preparing for this meeting. And I even chose my leaving date to be sure that it was after this meeting. So I've just been very grateful for all the opportunities, learning, professional and personal growth that I've had as a city employee. And maybe you expected me to say this at the beginning of the meeting. I don't know, but I'm just going to get through this. So for this meeting, what I agreed to do is I'll present the staff report, but really Renee and your staff will continue and be more engaged in the meeting, because it really does make sense that they talk about we'll do this and we'll do that. I can still say those things very easily. It rolls right off the tongue, but it just doesn't really feel exactly right. So anyway, I'll go ahead and make my way through the presentation.
Can't start yet after you just gave that speech. I think.
Why not? That's what I do. That's what everybody tells me. Betty, you just talk at those meetings. So
you are definitely going to be missed. Many of you may know that someone of a very big authority, which is my mother, watches council meetings from Long Island through the web streaming every week and gives me little notes. And so I asked her to give a comment about you, because she's a big fan. When she was here recently, she definitely wanted to meet Betty. So I'm just going to quote what she says, because I think it exemplifies a lot. She says, "I was always impressed with her ability to remain reasonable, responsive, and really patient when confronted with difficult challenges from the city council, wanting delays, changes, new directions, especially around the planned Santa Barbara update discussions. She will be missed. Also, her command and knowledge of the issues at hand was remarkable. Love, Mom." So, but Betty, thank you so much for your many, many years of service with the city, and I want to congratulate Renee. She has big shoes to fill for sure, and we know that your legacy, you can see it everywhere we go. So thank you so much for your leadership.
thank you. Okay, so we'll just do what we do.
Yeah, and then there's a big party we can talk about that later.
So for today's meeting, our agenda is introduction, that's happened. Brief reports. I'll cover the long-range planning section, design review and historic preservation, zoning and development review. We've also identified a few items for your discussion today. The housing element implementation, a briefing on the Funk Zone parking, a recent staff report, and meetings we've been having, and then other items that may come up from you all in the community for discussion today. Part of the long-range planning report will be given by Deborah Andaloro, who is the interim principal planner. Deborah has worked for the city for I don't know how many years, more than 10, I think. 18. But she's recently returned to be a team member in the local coastal program update project. And then with John Ledbetter's leaving the city, she's assumed the interim role of principal planner. So she'll share some information on the local coastal program update. So in long-range planning, recently we had the adoption of yet another housing element, and that process went very smoothly, working with the SBCAG in terms of its early development, coordinated with the Sustainable Community Strategy, RENA process, and all of that, so that we were able to fairly readily move into all the various stages of the housing element adoption. We did hold hearings and public forums, which the Planning Commission participated in, and then the Council approved it. So what about housing implementation? Just like Mr. Winnick spoke, we have these plans and policies, and really the steps moving forward towards those goals and policies is really important. So today we want to talk about prioritizing some housing element implementation. Included in your package is a table that shows the Phase 1 implementation of the general plan, and that's a table that we've used at these meetings now for the last 3-4 years. It is a Phase 1 table, and really it needs to be morphing into a Phase 2 table. Phase 1 of general plan implementation was envisioned to be approximately 5 years, which would be switching into Phase 2 around fiscal year 17. To help in that process, of course, we have the annual report of the general plan implementation and the adaptive management program. And these joint meetings that we hold with the Council and the Commission, we have the meeting, February, March, and then September, October timeframes. So in the fall of this year is when you would be receiving that annual report and talking about adaptive management. And that's where also some discussion of looking towards Phase 2 implementation would make sense. And then, as I said, Ms. Andaloro will give an update on the LCP. So here's that table that is included in your council agenda report, and it's a ever-evolving and active chart, actually. So there's probably X's missing, like even right at the top. I did review this briefly with Renee this morning, that I should have included an X, that the AUD monitoring is actually continuing throughout all the years of the program. So there should be an X at the top for fiscal 17. The growth management program has been adopted and implemented, and the council just even recently took a major step in an allocation of a community benefit project, which is part of the growth management program. So we are looking to make some adjustments to the traffic thresholds. That's less of a general plan implementation action, but in response to state legislation, the way the city reviews traffic impacts for CEQA is changing, and so we're actually still working on that project. When the Commission forwarded its recommendation on the air quality plan, they urged that the council, not the air quality plan, I'm sorry, the interim ordinance for setbacks. They urged the council to look to fund an updated air quality study, so that's, again, something you will be considering perhaps for fiscal year 16 or 17. The housing element implementation is on for today's primary discussion. Then we have some other items listed here, which I don't really want to go into a lot of detail because we don't have much to report on those other ones today, but we're keeping track of all the early identified implementation and next steps for the general plan. And so that's what this table shows, as well as the recently completed certifications of the housing element, historic resources, the zoning map amendments, safety element, emergency shelter ordinance and so forth. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Deborah Andaloro.
Okay. Good morning, Council and Commissioners. I'm going to give you a very brief update about what's been going on with the local coastal program. I know John Ledbetter was here in September, and just to refresh your memory, the city was awarded a grant from the Coastal Commission of $123,000, and the grant was to update the policies of our local coastal plan, which was certified back in the 1980s, modernize those policies, and then also address sea level rise adaptation. And part of that sea level rise adaptation includes incorporating work that's being done by the Bren School on sea level rise, and also coordinating regionally with others in our community on sea level rise. We have a 2-year timeline, and so it's very, very tight. We have to have the whole program adopted by council and submitted to the Coastal Commission by April 2016, so about a year from now. This work effort is only focused on the coastal zone within the city proper and does not include the airport. What we've been doing with regard to the land use plan is really taking a look at what we have existing in our land use plan and modernizing those, getting rid of the obsolete policies. We're incorporating the harbor master plan, so it's all going to be one document. A lot of the work effort that was addressed in the harbor master plan has been completed. And I just want to say we've had really great cooperation with not only the waterfront staff, but Parks and Recreation, Public Works. They've really been instrumental in helping us with this effort. Let's see. Luckily, we have a fairly new general plan, so we can pull a lot of our policies from that work effort and make them more tailored for our coastal zone. We have a 2013 safety element, which had the preliminary framework for addressing sea level rise in it. So we have good information there that we can build off of. And then really, if you think about in 1980, a lot of our coastal policies were really dealing with bringing our land use and zoning into compliance with the Coastal Act. And during this interim period of 35 years or so, we have really developed a lot of programs and other policies, guidelines and such that really do address coastal resource protection. And so we're folding a lot of that information into the land use plan at this time. And then other things that are driving what we're putting into the land use plan also include the Coastal Commission has put out a LCP update guide, which really tells us a lot of items that we need to address. And again, we have a lot of this information in, plans, programs, our municipal code. So it's really taking that information and putting it into a new land use plan to basically prove to Coastal Commission that City of Santa Barbara is doing their due diligence to protect coastal resources. We met early on with Coastal Commission staff and got a lot of direction about how to formulate this land use plan, what we could and couldn't do. And so to the degree possible, we're trying to follow that direction. We are also going to be preparing, and we've actually done probably 80% of the land use plan at this point. We've taken our first cut. We made a submittal to Coastal Commission staff at the beginning of February. We've had a check-in meeting with them, and tomorrow, actually, the staff is coming here to the city to talk with us. So that's progressing nicely. With the implementation plan, that's solely going to be focused on sea level rise, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges with that in a moment. We do have a lot of, like I said, policies that were already developed as part of the climate action plan that were folded into the 2013 safety element, so we can build off some of that information. As far as schedule, I believe when John was here in September, he had reported the way this grant was set up, we were supposed to be having monthly meetings with Coastal Commission staff. There was a departure in their staff late summer of 2014, and they were really short-staffed, and so not a lot was going on. We continued to plug along and actually met with the Planning Commission Subcommittee, Parks and Rec Subcommittee, and Harbor Commission Subcommittee, and got some good information. And at the time, we were planning on going with just chapters, basically, periodically. And that seemed to be a little problematic if we were only giving them one chapter at a time. The question was always like, well, where are you addressing this? And so being that we weren't going to have the Coastal Commission staff review because they didn't have a staff to review, we decided, you know what, let's kind of suspend meeting with the subcommittees and let's just hunker down and prepare the majority of the plan, which we've done now. In the late fall, early winter, Coastal Commission did hire new analysts. We were assigned 2 new analysts and a supervisor to review our project, and so we resumed in December meeting with them on a regular basis. Unfortunately, we had to bring the new staff up to speed, so that's taken a little bit of time, but I think we're getting close to having them back where we were last summer. We have scheduled, we're now ready to go back and start working with the subcommittees on this fuller draft. And so all of those subcommittee meetings have been set up for the last 2 weeks in March. We are still awaiting information on sea level rise, and since it's an evolving science, our timing is, we're on a pretty strict time path, and the sea level rise information isn't on the same path as us. So that's a little bit of a challenge. We will do what we can, come up with a complete draft by the summer and hold our public workshops in the fall. We will be going around to all the boards and commissions. And then early 2016, hopefully be at council for adoption and get this into the Coastal Commission by the end of April of next year. It's really tight.
May I ask,
Sure.
Are there indications of sea level rise in Santa Barbara now? I mean, we have facilities out there. There must be some preliminary thought about it.
Oh, yes. There are so many studies going on right now. What we're having a hard time is wrapping our arms around, well, what makes sense for us to be looking at to project into the future. The good news is it doesn't look as though we're going to be affected in really any significant negative way for quite some time with sea level rise. But just even establishing what should be our planning period for looking at this, because the timelines that the scientists are looking at are 2030, 2050, and 2100. And then they take a high, medium, low. It's just so much data for us to try and wrap our arms around. But our current challenges are the sea level rise, the science, the modeling, and the timing of it. And we are now just in the throes of working with all these regional organizations and jurisdictions that are grappling with this at the same time that we are. And at the same time, we have this grant timeline, and we can't really wait for the information to be finalized. I think what we're going to probably end up coming up with is for the implementation program, it's going to be a really well thought out next step work program to explore exactly what is the data that we need in order for us to come up with maybe changes to regulations or policies to address sea level rise. One of the
question.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. First, I want to acknowledge Ms. Andaloro and Liz Limon on the subcommittee because Commissioners Thompson and Pujol and myself are working with you, and I appreciate all of staff's efforts. My question is the timing of the work with Bren. They've completed their work, and they'll be making a public presentation, as you know, on April 24th. So how will that fold into our subcommittee work and staff's work vis-a-vis the Coastal Commission staff?
Commissioner Schwartz, what we have received from the Bren School so far is a very rough draft, not a complete draft of their work. They have I believe next Friday is their final product.
Defense academic.
Yeah, supposed to be submitted to us. And so not knowing the complete work that they're going to be providing, don't know exactly how we're going to fold it in. One of the issues that we're that we've realized with all of the studies that have gone on so far is that they do not account for existing protective devices that we have in place today. And so what we're seeing is as though those don't exist, which isn't our reality. And also it doesn't account for any of the management the shoreline management programs that we have existing today. So, yeah, they're giving us information, but it's not necessarily what we would consider to be the reality that we're going to be dealing with in the future. So we're trying to figure out how do we get to a more realistic view of our coastal zone.
Outside the scope of what we asked them to study?
Yes. They've come up with great information. We're going to have to figure out how we can incorporate it into our land use plan.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm sure, I know we have an LCP subcommittee meeting coming up.
Yes, you do.
Sure, we do.
Yes,
right.
you do.
Yes. So I'm sure we'll be talking more,
We
but
have-
just for general, consumption and
Yes.
discussion today. Okay. Thank you.
So with that, that's sort of brings you up to date with where we're at. And if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. And staff's available outside of this meeting, too, if you want to learn more about what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. So turning to the design review program, there's been quite a bit of activity completed in the last 6 months or year, and things currently active as well as pending. So as you all are aware, the structure of the sign committee was changed as a result of budget times, where instead of staffing another independent body reviewing sign applications, we scaled them back to 2 members who have served on the committee for a long time, Bob Cunningham and Natalie Cope, performing the majority of the reviews for conforming reviews. And then when needed, sign applications go on the consent calendars of the ABR or HLC. And then also when appropriate for like major sign programs, they'll be on the full regular agenda of either the ABR and HLC. And Mr. Limon conducted a review with many people involved in that process, and they decided for now to keep it as is. That's something just to be aware of, that we'll continually evaluate how it's working and whether or not it needs to go back to makes sense to go back to a regular structure as it had in the past. Along the way with the signs, a whole complete database of all sign programs in the city was completed. Minor guideline work that is still underway relates to backflow devices, electric vehicle charging, outdoor lighting, and art and murals. With the council's recent review of an appeal, you asked that staff look to make some minor changes to those guidelines, and so that work's underway now. The solar awards, we've had a hiatus on that program, but we're bringing on an intern this summer and are looking forward to going back to council in the fall with a solar awards program. And given changes in state law and processing direction for solar installations, our staff, working with the Building and Safety Division as well as City Attorney, is going to be bringing forward updated regulations and procedures for solar installations. Wireless antenna database and mapping, we've just about completed that baseline information, and that will be helpful when the city, again, working with the City Attorney's Office, they're looking to bring on special counsel to assist in an update of the city's ordinances related to wireless antenna regulations. And so that's something in the design review group they've been working on too. Review of the Haley-Milpas design guidelines. I'm not sure if any of you, those that are following the ABR's review and discussion, the feeling is that these guidelines are very much out of date, and as some of this corridor area is identified for priority housing, there is a desire to update these guidelines. And as your discussion moves forward today, looking at different ways to consider updating and possibly combining cities' design guidelines to more comprehensively cover issues of multi-unit and mixed-use type projects. Perhaps instead of having an independent Haley-Milpas design guideline update, there might be a more comprehensive approach to looking at that. Mr. Winnick was here and mentioned the AIA. There's definitely interest in looking at architectural styles citywide, and they have expressed a desire to have a collaborative project perhaps with the city and have a community discussion of architectural styles. That's one of the points that has been brought to discussion in the Haley-Milpas, but actually it's something that the Single Family Design Board grapples with from time to time, as of course HLC and El Pueblo Viejo has a very well defined style guide, but in other parts of the city, not so much. I believe the council's been somewhat up to date in the commission. We provided a briefing from Andrew Stuffler, the building official, about work that he and his staff are doing in the community with contractors and active projects, particularly dealing with the revisions that occur in the field. And Mr. Limon has been working with Building and Safety and developed a revision process flow chart. There was a meeting with the Contractors Association, I think just last week, and we're starting to share that information to give a path forward so that people, before they make the field changes, they know they can come in and have them reviewed in an orderly manner. And so there's also some building inspector training going on with planning and building inspectors. The list of items to work on in design review is always long, and so there are some that have been around for a while, and they're really still on the back burner, updating the landscape ordinance for some minor revisions, and also some technical changes for the Chapala Street guidelines that Public Works was looking to have made. Those are on back burner. Historic preservation, recently completed, now pretty much on a regular annual basis. The designation process is moving forward each year with designations, and that's something that we really need to credit Jaime and Nicole Hernandez, as well as the Historic Landmarks Commission, working hard to see that those are more of a regular thing. We also, in order to keep those moving, use interns from time to time, and that's a win-win for them as students to learn some practical application of their studies. The Mills contract is a process that, as we're approached and we are aware of property owners looking to make significant investment in restoration type projects, we've had 6 Mills Act contracts. And then also recently at Council we had the HLC Design Awards. In preparation for districting as well as just maintenance of an inventory of city historic properties and resources, there's ongoing work, and I want to say that this type of work is something that does implement the historic resources element. There are many policies and programs within the historic resources element that are actively being implemented. I think Mr. Winnick's concern carried forward from Ms. Arias is one specific program within the historic element that we've been working on for a while, and that's the consideration of historic districts. We have been to the ordinance committee sometime in the past, and we were just getting ready to develop the ordinance further with Mr. Wiley, and then we've just been able to work on it sporadically since his departure. So we've completed the draft citywide historic resource guidelines and architectural styles related to historic districts, and we had that prior meeting with the ordinance committee, and we are also doing ongoing public outreach and meetings with the Historic Landmarks Commission to make sure that we have properly identified potential individuals, properties, as well as possible future districts. So this is a very active part of the historic preservation work program. The main piece is getting back to the ordinance. So short-term, other things that are underway, again, implementing the historic resources element. The council did authorize a public information tool, a web-based search engine, where, again, doing all the complete mapping of where are the resources, identifying them, and then making that information all available on the web. We decided, working with the information systems group, that using the Civica, the same people that do the city's web, rather than an independent web operator system, we're going to go with the Civica, and we'll be at council in April. Again, to support the web base and all of the just data and public information, a lot of work is still ongoing, looking to scan all the archaeological reports and then mapping, particularly areas like around the Mission Waterworks. That's come up recently, so we're making sure that that's all accurately identified.
Mayor, may I ask a question? Ms. Weiss, I've heard from some developers and architects an interest in outside of a particular application that might be making its way through the city, sort of larger discussions. It could be implementation workshops to understand and work through some of our competing interests in, for example, the 250-foot buffer for the mapping and historic resource protection, at the same time allowing for appropriate development within El Pueblo Viejo. So I don't know, to Mr. Winnick's point, if we're engaging the AIA further, allowing, for example, maybe scheduling some implementation discussions or workshops with AIA, and also, of course, interested in other non-AIA developers before they bring an application, and how to talk through that, because we do have some competing policies and interests. Of course, we talk about it a lot at the Planning Commission, but this is now coming forward. I'm hearing from the development and architectural community.
Just a brief comment, and I'm not sure if Jaime wants to add. The buffering or screening, we called it a setback or a buffer, in the policy, but we also have been explaining that it's really a flag that if a project comes in and we have a nearby resource, we want an awareness of that. Now, if this nearby resource is within 250 feet, but it's not within the view area, there are no connections to that property, or maybe there are. Perhaps there is an opportunity to have a view corridor towards a resource within that area of influence. So these are things we really intended the buffer to be a tool to flag the resources. It's not to say that you couldn't build an AUD apartment building if you're within that area. It's
more of a consideration factor.
Yes, and again, that's my understanding.
Opposed to,
and that's both.
Just know that I know that community is very keenly aware of this and concerned. So I didn't know if there's going to be an opportunity outside of kind of a single applicant by applicant basis for discussions with that, especially now that with the economic rebound, we're seeing more applications coming to the city.
Well, I'm not sure how Jaime would like to handle that, but I think it would probably be good to actually look at actual projects and how was it handled as an indication. If we've successfully looked at projects within a buffer area, that would be something you could share as an example of how it might be done. But we'll see.
Okay, we'll probably have other conversations another time. Thanks.
Just a briefing on the zoning program. Plan check performance is up. The council authorized an added position in zoning plan check, and it's working. Enforcement highlights as well. We provided you just some brief numbers on the enforcement program. The city has, we have a full-time enforcement position as well as 2 hourlies, and they've made great strides and are very current now with all high priority inquiries for zoning enforcement. We have a joint committee of Council and Planning Commission on the new zoning ordinance, and they recently held a joint committee meeting, and they're preparing for the open community discussion of the framework of the zoning ordinance update. So I think most of you are up to date on that. When we talk about the new zoning ordinance, we always like to frame it within what's included and what's not included, because again, people don't always understand single family design review. How does that relate to the zoning ordinance? Or various topics, climate change, is that somehow related to the zoning ordinance? So the primary structure of the update will be what is shared in this first public workshop. So I think that'll be very helpful. And I think, what is that, March 18th, I believe. Did I get that right? Okay. In development review, we are seeing an increase in development activity, and this increase is both with old projects that have been around for a while, coming back in various stages, as well as new development interest. We provided a pretty extensive list of projects as an attachment to your council report. We're not going to necessarily present any specific project information here today, but if you had any questions about a project, the development review staff perhaps could answer those. Active also in the development review section is working with the Planning Commission on the AUD process and monitoring. The Planning Commission has created a subcommittee, and that subcommittee's interest was specifically around AUD, but more broadly now, and as we're talking about the general plan housing element implementation, we see the policy subcommittee of the Planning Commission being helpful to move forward with other aspects of the housing element as well. The staff has developed a web page where people can become updated to with the status of AUD projects. And then development and environmental review staff is active in the drought team. We are working with, we were at the Planning Commission recently, and will be part of the reports coming to council on possible drought regulations, and have been involved in the desal permitting and environmental review associated with that as well.
Go ahead.
Ms. Weiss, to go back to the AUD process, I saw in the report that we might need consultant help with the multifamily design guidelines. Does that connect with the AUD?
Yes, I believe that the idea, and that's my next few slides. So I'll answer that hopefully.
Thank you.
Within the context of, for your discussion today, again, if you have any questions on the briefings or such, but
Why don't we, if there are questions or comments on things other than housing element implementation or func zone parking, which you're going to get to, but just to see if there's anything else that you want to bring up at this point around the table. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ms. Weiss, recently, while dealing with one particular constituent issue, and it has to do with, you talked about solar awards and historical districts. And I was digging through apparently what was now state regulation about solar installations trumping aesthetic limitations. And I was wondering about the preservation of some of our historical districts versus the implementation of creating solar energy, and how that was going to play out.
I think Scott Vincent best to answer that. Thanks.
Good morning, Madam Mayor, members of council. Speaking to that issue, it's a state statute. It's not a regulation. It was actually an act of the legislature, and they've taken the balance between promoting private solar installations, and they're supporting the installation of private solar installations, and they have minimized the procedural requirements for, particularly in the case of residential installations. They have minimized, and Mr. Stuffler, that this is one of our work products or work efforts this year, will be to amend our ordinances regulating solar installations in order to be consistent with the state statute. One is that a small residential installation on a private residence, if it meets certain design standards, is an administrative permit. There is no discretionary review, and they've taken out the aesthetic review that we normally would have. And this is what where the intersection of the competing interests it hits for Santa Barbara. The state statute says that local regulations can protect public safety, welfare, public health and safety, but they have conspicuously left out public welfare, which is typically the area of the police power that governs design review, historic review, and aesthetic concerns. And so many communities throughout California are grappling with this, the tension between the community's desire to protect that public welfare element through design review, yet at the same time giving effect to the legislature's clear priority for purposes of generating electricity through clean energy through solar installations. And so that's going to be one of that. I would recommend the council and the commission to look for our solutions in this upcoming ordinance, and we'll be working on trying to do our best to balance those two interests within the framework that the legislature has left us.
I just would add that we've always been somewhat in this context of limited review ability of solar installations, and that's why the city developed the Solar Design Awards. So the idea is if the city can get out there more with the design award and the guidelines being used before someone comes into the building to say, here's my solar contractor, I meet all of these, I'd like my permit, within the next 8 hours or 24 hours, and they don't know anything about the solar guidelines. So that's, a proactive step is your best defense, I think, in the solar area.
Other questions on, yes, Mr. Addison?
Betty, several times you mentioned, and I know it keeps coming up at times, different design guidelines. We have now a single general plan with all the elements included as chapters, so everybody knows where to go to find that information. We're working on updating the zoning ordinance, but when it gets down to design guidelines, we have a multitude of different little pamphlets and so forth. Has the staff considered rolling all the design guidelines into a single document with the various and sundry different sections of town as separate chapters so that everybody in the community knows where to go for that level of detail? Seems like a way forward that might make some of the confusion that currently exists go away.
Yes, that's the topic of the next few slides.
Okay, we'll get there.
I didn't realize that.
Okay. Anything else on items other than the next two discussion items? Okay, I have one question, or just sort of bring out there, which is the Arts Master Plan, which seems to be continually, quote, in process, but my impression is we don't know exactly who's in charge, and that is then creating delays, and whether it's through the Arts Commission staff or our own staff, and I know it's a staffing issue and a prioritization issue, but it is something, there's a lot going on in the arts community in different parts of town, and so I'm not quite sure what the question or answer is, but I just wanted to raise the level of awareness about it, and perhaps maybe offline try to figure out what the best process is moving forward to see how we can actually complete an arts master plan in the next year or two. So unless there's anything, and Betty said, sure, we can do that because she's out the door, coming. But if you could comment on that.
I'd intended on having an offline conversation before the meeting, and I didn't get a chance to touch base with you, so I definitely would like to do that after. But I've been in contact with Ginny Brush as well as others that may be interested in helping move that project forward. As far as my view of the planning staff's ability to work on that right now, it's extremely limited. At one time, we asked Liz Limon to be of assistance, but she's fully engaged in the LCP update. So I think it's looking for a little opening and then seizing that, if possible, might be the strategy. But I have some other ideas as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on with the discussion items.
So in terms of housing implementation, we want to just quickly review the policy direction. Again, in your staff report, we provided some policy language from the general plan. There are both required and possible actions related to the housing element. Required are some of the HCD regulations and things that we know we need to do. Possible actions are many, and we do have recommendations to look at design guidelines as a critical tool that right now at this time, it's very timely, updating the zoning ordinance, having the comprehensive general plan completed, encouraging certain development in certain areas, and then having an array of guidance on design, and design is so important. How might we fold those things together with this effort that the general plan does envision? So with that discussion today, we're also looking for your direction for focus and priority, and then we have some ideas on next steps for housing implementation. Some level of discussion on this topic's already occurred with the Planning Commission, the subcommittee, as well as a discussion work session meeting. I believe that was January? Yeah. So policy direction in the general plan, clearly very important in our community is community character, and the policy from the land use element is to strengthen and enhance design and development review standards and process to enhance community character, promote affordable housing, and further community sustainable principles. And again, the AUD program is one way of doing that, and having design guidelines and other enhancements of the review process could further this policy. It the general plan has policy direction for implementation in the land use element 13, policy LG 13, as well as the housing element 16.8, to develop multifamily, or what I prefer to call multi-unit and mixed-use design guidelines, develop multifamily residential design guidelines and standards to address unit sizes, setbacks, open space, landscaping, building size, bulk and scale, and site planning, e.g. pedestrian-friendly design, front porches facing street, and parking located out of sight. Now, the urban design guidelines does quite a bit of this, but the way that document is drafted is it applies to the city grid. And it could really be expanded as a more broad set of guidelines to apply citywide. There's only a few areas outside of the grid anyway, and it might have more use if people thought of it as citywide guidelines instead of urban, just the grid. Is one example of what staff has been thinking. Some of these topics, of course, have been folded into the AUD as ordinance standards, but ordinance standards set minimums or standard type of information, yet design and design guidelines are how are those things applied, and so updating the tools and design guidelines could be helpful. So in the housing element, there are 117 implementation actions. Many of them are ongoing, and in your housing element, you need to demonstrate to the state what the city does just as a normal course of business. So that's, quite a few, which is 75 ongoing. Of the ongoing, we need to complete annual reports for at least 9 of them, and this is one of those kind of required actions to maintain your status. With the state, we want to be submitting these annual reports because that helps with, it's a requirement for certain grant funding. Then the work program included in the housing element has timeframes. Also, you're required to have an implementation plan with timeframes. So we focused on those in either the 1 to 2 year period or 3 to 5 year period, and had a discussion with the Planning Commission, and the attachments to your council report were the outline for that discussion. Staff's recommendations of immediate implementation actions are updating the bonus density ordinance. It's out of sync with the state, and it won't be a huge work project, but it does need to happen. The AUD monitoring is an essential component of our housing element and general plan, so that's ongoing. The multi-unit and mixed-use design guidelines is our recommendation for your consideration today. Zoning standards, while we're updating the new zoning ordinance, there are a few subjects such as like tandem parking and things like that we knew were going to be addressed in the zoning ordinance anyway, and they're called out for in the housing elements, so we've just identified those. And then there's the issue of preservation of rental units. So based on what we know of interests going on in the community and wanting to encourage and quality project designs, this is our list of recommended implementation actions for the near term. As I mentioned, the bonus density ordinance, and then AUD, and then multi-unit. It is a top priority. It's been on the list of things to look at for many years. We do think that undertaking this project, working closely with the AIA, would be helpful. However, we've tried to make progress on this project for many years, and we think that some funding to support the effort would help make it happen and not have it delayed. So we do think that additional funding is needed on that. The preservation of rental units, explore ways to preserve rental housing. Certainly an issue in our community and then throughout the world at this point is the popularity of the vacation rental by owner or Airbnb and those sort of operations. And housing as a important part of our community, housing those that are homeless, keeping people in housing that are potentially homeless, having quality neighborhoods and residential environments for all, no matter what your socioeconomic level is. This is a primary objective of the city's plan and the community. And the impact of vacation rentals on the community and the availability of rental and the change in the community character is something that I know everyone here has been thinking about. So we put that on the agenda to hear if at this time the Council and Commission want to discuss that and give possible direction to staff to begin a process examining that or not, but at least this is an opportunity to have that discussion today. So the thought process on this is that the discussion will help to identify the priority projects. Based on that general direction, staff would further develop scope of work and potential funding needs. We could work, depending on the topics of interest, with the subcommittee of the Planning Commission and or HLC and ABR, certainly if it's the design guidelines, to better define the proposals and return to council for budget consideration at some point. So that's the primary topic for discussion today. But we did also provide the Funk Zone waterfront parking background report. Should I go through this just now quickly? Okay, so in your report, we attached a summary report that looks at the land use and parking issues in and around the waterfront and Funk Zone. We've had a number of discussions with applicants on their projects that range from very small, just properties and small buildings trying to make fixes and improvements, to medium scale projects, to major scale projects in the waterfront Funk Zone. And it was a challenge for us all to get on the same page. So this comprehensive report really does that, and we've received a lot of positive feedback of how helpful that comprehensive report is now to move forward in these discussions. And our hope was that in meeting with the group of interested property owners, as we did a few weeks ago, that they understand how important it is that they come together to consider how parking and the availability of parking and possible shared parking and all of that, how they can work together to address that rather than come just to the city to expect to lay this upon you to solve. In particular, the paper helps people understand that some of the parking resources in the waterfront area in the context of the Coastal Act and the local coastal program is really important. And accessing that parking and having it available for everyone's use is one thing, but having that parking be counted towards new intensification and development is definitely another. And so I think people are now having much more the same conversation. And George Buell, Community Development Director, is definitely in contact with leaders in the group of property owners and businesses in the waterfront area. And we do expect these conversations to continue. And so today, we just, again, this is a possible forum for you to ask us questions about how that conversation is going. We didn't schedule it to ask for any policy direction per se on that topic. Okay, that concludes the report.
Great.
Thank you.
I want to open it up to the public first in case there's any comments at this point before it comes back to us. Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public comment period. So it comes to us. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Vacation rentals, what's the way to move that forward? Because that's an acute question before the public.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members, and commissioners. Vacation rentals. So your question was, next steps, how do we...
Yeah, how do we move this forward to resolve it?
So I guess depending on how the council and community might want to resolve it, there's different ways we can address it. As you all know, right now, vacation rentals are not allowed in single-family zones. So we do get some complaints from neighbors, adjacent property owners about that, and we do try to enforce as we can, prove them up that they are actually violating the ordinance. So that's our current state of how we're addressing them. To actually comprehensively address them as a community, we have been in communication and following some other communities who have recently adopted ordinances that try to manage them in various ways, and so that's something we could seek to do. We do believe that we would need some help to do that, though. With everything else we have going on within the division, we would need help to do that outreach and engage all the stakeholders involved in vacation rentals in order to make sure that what we have going forward would be, somewhat, would have some buy-in in the community.
What sort of help do you mean?
We would need help just managing the outreach, researching what other communities are doing, how that might work in Santa Barbara. So it's really the legwork of pulling together a draft ordinance, but also, before that, doing the outreach. And because we're hearing from one sector of the community that there are definitely concerns with vacation rentals. We know that they occupy a fair number of our single-family homes and are not making those homes available to long-term renters, and so that is a concern. But we also obviously have many homeowners who are interested in having that as an option for them, and so we need to make sure that we reach out to everybody.
And you're talking about hiring outside help to do this?
Yes.
Do we have any idea what kind of money we're talking about?
I think we've estimated. Did we say? Okay, I think that's in possibly up for consideration. Oh, do you have that? 60,000 is what I'm hearing for some consultant help.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Enforcement's another element of it.
Okay, we're just
Right.
gonna go around the circle here.
Right.
So
Just sorry, I was reminded. One other element of that is enforcement. So we do have difficulty enforcing our current ordinance. From what we've seen, what other communities have recently adopted, enforcement still remains a potential concern, depending on how the ordinance is written. And if we limit vacation rentals to a certain number of calendar days or days in the week, then we still have an element of enforcement we need to figure out.
Mr. Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, it seems like the subjects that were brought up are kind of a tangled web of inextricably connected problems, and that has to do. Commissioner Schwartz and I met a couple of years ago and talked about the funk zone and really the lack of a general planning, parking, and circulation overlay. And it's putting the genie back in the bottle now is going to be tricky. We have the VRBO issue that has potentially impacts on available rental property as well. And then we have another elephant in the living room, and that's explosive growth of both Santa Barbara City College as well as UCSB, and those impacts on the community and our control or lack thereof of that situation. So it's as I look at our ability to develop our plans and go forward with our policies, we're going to have to get some more players in the room as far as I can see. You've got some property owners in the waterfront area that are very concerned about their abilities to move forward, but clearly it's the Wild West down there at the moment. There's no parking zone. There's not adequate parking. The use of the public right-of-way is I won't go into what I usually say about it anyway. And then, of course, we have the issues with the growth of City College. And as a neighbor of that area, I completely see the impacts every day, and as a harbor user and a former waterfront tenant. So I don't know how we wrestle that one to the ground, but we have quite a few. So it should be a matter of our focus if we're going to have a cogent policy that reflects what we do both there and on the north side, where we have obviously traffic circulation and parking issues, to get this right. And I don't think diminishing parking requirements, building out units that don't have adequately parked facilities is going to be the answer. And I know that's been proposed on a number of levels. So going forward, these will be big issues, not just the VRBO. That's kind of been a focus lately, but I think I think they're all tied in together, and they all have similar impacts on what we're trying to do going forward.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've been very concerned about the vacation rental issue and did some poking around. And from what I can tell, I think they're somewhere between 1% and 2% of the apartments or single-family homes in town are used as vacation rentals. And it's very profitable. Investors buy homes or turn their apartments. I've heard of cases where tenants have been evicted so they could turn it into a vacation rental. Now, vacation rentals are allowed in the R4 zone, which is a surprisingly large part of the city. All the waterfront, like East Cabrillo area, West Cabrillo area, and then all up along the inner west side between the freeway and State Street. A lot of that is R4, which, according to our current zoning, is an allowed use. The city is getting a substantial chunk of change out of the TOT for these vacation rentals. It's $867,000 or $65,000 last year alone on vacation rentals. These aren't, but that is only 0.007% of the general fund revenues. So it doesn't make up that huge an amount of the city's income. I talked to a friend who worked for Paradise Retreats. The city has, let's see, they have there are 266 active licenses. However, one of those is for Paradise Retreats, and they manage 80 units. So that number of licenses that are out there is no reflection of the number of units. And I know of some communities have, like Alita, adopted an ordinance regulating them. That helps take care of the problem of noise late at night and that sort of thing. You have people strangers coming and going to your neighborhood day and night. I was surprised to learn that some of them are in Bungalow Haven, and they're there because it's easy, you can walk to the bowl. And so people rent them, go to the concert at the bowl, and then they come back and they party. And one person has right next to her a place where the owner put in a hot tub in the setback. And yes, and they're like right under their windows till all hours, enjoying themselves in a single family residential area. So I think regulating them isn't good enough. That we have to, and I don't know how we do this, but I think it's really necessary. I met a woman who moved and lived in Santa Barbara for many years, and because the character of her neighborhood had changed because of vacation rentals, she moved to Solvang, and her husband now commutes over 154 every day to Santa Barbara. The exact opposite of what we want to see, and it was because of the effect that the vacation rentals. And she told me that she knows 3 other families in the Solvang area who moved for the same reason. So I do think it's something we need to pay attention to. I don't have any answers as to how, but I think simple regulation of vacation rentals isn't going to do the job.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. About funk zone parking in the LCP amendment, why are we not including language or having discussions with coastal staff about that PBIA now, given the fact that there's language in the LCP that talks about that, the interest that is occurring down there, and the LCP, substantial effort to do that, or can that be tabled for soon thereafter, or?
Good question. Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. Right now, with the LCP update, we are focusing on the land use plan, and you are correct. There are policies in the plan, and as well as in our circulation element, that could support shared use of parking and parking resources, and something like a PBID or PBIA. But because we're focusing on the land use plan at this point, it wouldn't be the appropriate place to deal with a parking district. That would be the follow-up step in the implementation plan of the LCP, where we would be able to, because as you know, the way the downtown business district works, it's established as a district where the business owners assess themselves, and then they're also afforded a zone of benefit for zoning standards for parking. That does not apply in the coastal zone, because to do that would require an LCP amendment to amend our zoning ordinance for that particular section to apply in the coastal zone. So we'd be looking at, really it's an implementation plan component of the LCP to have that take effect there, and we were not intending to do that until we got through the LUP update. So what it's not to say we couldn't take that forward independently. It would refocus our efforts, though, and we don't want to lose track of where we are in the LUP update. Also, we do have the new zoning ordinance underway, and that could help inform not only what happens throughout the city and whether there is interest community-wide to have a similar program down in the funk zone, but one of our follow-up steps after the new zoning ordinance effort is complete is to then submit what is applicable to the Coastal Commission so that those new standards would apply in the coastal zone. So that could be a follow-on in a couple of years.
I guess I'd like to just see that we're broadcasting what our plans are. And if we don't have a cogent plan right now, that at least we're indicating to the coastal staff that it's something is coming, and so that it's not a brand new thing that'll take forever to get done when we finally have a plan.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Schneider. I think Ms. Brooke described the procedural way in which the possible zone of benefit and shared parking could be formalized as an implementation standard. However, really, the dialogue that needs to occur is with the property owners and the businesses and the council on whether or not it's appropriate for that area, and what are the available parking spaces. Are they truly available? What is their primary purpose, serving public recreation and access to the beach in terms of the Coastal Act, and then possibility for enhancing those resources or adding to them. And that's what we really encouraged the businesses and people to talk about first. So although we have policy basis for doing that, and we could write a code that says, your parking is provided this way or that, you need to have a technical basis. What are the supplies and demands for the parking in that area? So I don't think it's a matter of where we are in the LCP. It's more a matter of where is the community, the businesses, and the council on what is the need for parking and what is the supply. Is it adequate? Will there be additional supply, and who will pay for that supply? And all of those kind of technical things that are needed before you form a district or before you create a new zone of benefit and say that your parking is being met off-site. You need to know where that is. And so the policy framework is there. It's this engagement of the people involved that is what Mr. Buell is really encouraging. And every conversation I've been in, that's pretty much how you end the conversation. And not ending it, but encouraging for the next steps of those folks involved.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think nobody's blessed your slide yet with priorities, so I'll say I think you're spot on for those and the subsequent slides that break out the actions. Just in terms of some comments on that, I'm ecstatic to see finally the mention of the subcommittee word on paper in the AUD process. I think up until this time it's kind of been a push back and forth, and maybe a little bit of tension between some of the Planning Commission members and staff. I look back to all those room meetings in room 15 as part of the general plan update, and all the harsh words and the fears that were brought up then. And I continue to be worried that we're going to get to, maybe in another year, we're going to get to 250 certificates of occupancy issued, and we'll just be 3 years into the process, and council will then be forced to let it roll back to the prior process or have the discussion again on what it should look like going forward. And we'll have to fight those battles all over again without having any kind of data on resolving what those original arguments were. The effect on neighborhood parking, the effect on character, the erosion of business parking, the size, bulk, and scale, how it looked like before. And Scott Vincent always tells me when I talk about this that what does this look like that you're talking about? And I don't really have an answer, because I'm really asking. I'm concerned about trying to define some of the undefinables. What's a snapshot of what it looks like in a neighborhood or an area before the project versus what's it going to look like afterwards? So that's why we have a subcommittee, I think, to help work through that process and come up with those ideas. In terms of the housing element, just a couple comments to share to a bigger audience than when we went through it. I know that it's not necessarily part of the housing element, but I continue to be concerned about the city's lack of role in developing true middle-income earning residents. The attraction, say, of Sonos-type employees, true white-collar workers, nurses, policemen, teachers, that type of thing, who actually have availability to housing in town, and the continued erosion of that tax base and revenue source for the city. The housing element probably isn't the right place to address that, but we go to great lengths to address whatever it is, a dozen different economic strata within different types of income, but we kind of don't put the same effort into where I think we would get a bigger bang for our buck and return, and also that buck supports all those other goals, all those other social goals for other types of housing. And in the other instance, I think on that is there was a very spirited discussion when we went through the housing element process regarding Santa Barbara City College. In my opinion, that language in the housing element as a constraint was watered down. And I only bring this up again today because I saw Bendy's comments Tuesday at council on reporting out on the joint meeting between the trustees and the council that there was really very little opportunity for more input on some of the other issues. And I agree. I'm also a neighbor of City of City College on the Mesa. I see the growing influence both in terms of traffic, parking, and also in regards to loss of housing when you have a strategy that goes out and tries to bring students in from around the world or even out of the region and need the housing on a short-term basis for their students. It artificially takes away from the housing stock. It drives up the prices. And I think the longer we continue to avoid that issue or not look for ways to bring that issue to the table, it will just get worse. And then finally, on vacation rentals, I agree with Commissioner Lodge. I think I'm even a little more harsh than Commissioner Lodge. If I was at home watching that presentation right now, Renee, I would say what was markedly missing in it was any reference in your narrative about the city also having a finance department that went out and researched and found those people to get the almost $1 million in revenue, while at the same time we were sitting back and waiting for people to complain about the same properties or ignoring those two connections within the city structure. I would almost prefer to see we just send out cease and desist orders to everyone that we know, and then we start working on the fix. It's almost like the first day of school, and the teacher shouldn't be cracking a smile for a week. We should be starting strong and then working our way into what will work for the neighborhoods. Right now, we don't really have a lot of credibility there because we're collecting money in one building, and the other building we're saying, come complain about it. And I think that just puts us in a really bad position. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just continuing some points that Commissioner Jordan made on the reason for AUD subcommittee was to try to come up with objective standards or suggestions on subjective standards now, so that as the projects that will be evaluated, the high and the overlay, know what their, let's say, their reporting requirements would be if we are requesting information from either from the rental management. And then secondly, to be building into their program the idea looking forward that this is what we're going to be looking at. Also, the design boards, when they do their trade-offs on compatibility and size, bulk, and scale, would have an idea on how we're going to evaluate in the future. Interestingly, the first several projects that came in are really re-applications on projects that were submitted previously. And so it's interesting to follow them, what they were before under variable density and what they've come in now, to see a comparison. Are they starting to achieve more of the goals that we have in our general plan? So I think subcommittee would really like to look at how to evaluate, how to get a good sample size, how to get information that's not really confidential. It's going to be hard to get from individual renters rather, and come up with those suggestions to consider and try to get them implemented pretty quickly so everybody knows what the rules are. Secondly, on the Michael mentioned about the economics. I think we mentioned at one planning commission, our revenue is really, I believe, is generated from there's three pieces of the pie, and it's transit occupancy tax, property taxes, and sales taxes. I think are pretty equal pieces right now. So hopefully going forward, all of those pieces increase proportionally, and we get a bigger pie on revenues. And the middle class, a portion of the middle class being able to live here and spend their money here, could have a very significant impact both on sales taxes, property taxes, and spending their money in a different part of town. So it would be interesting to see on the Upper State Street project, Mirasol, maybe what the economic effect is of that particular project, or do some type of evaluation qualitatively, let's say, on what they're adding to the purchasing capability up there, the sales capability, without really having to add any parking to the shopping center across the street. Does it have a favorable impact or not? But the economics of the housing units produced for middle income, I think, could be very significant. On the as far as vacation rentals, I'm glad that primarily we're considering making a public discourse because it affects people in a different way. We are encouraging tourism, and I believe if you add it up, there may be somebody can tell me 400 to 500 of motel or hotel rooms that are in process or being rehabbed right now or planned when you add it up. So there's a demand for, if that's the number, however many hundred, there's a demand for that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be building it. So the people who do come up to visit and vacation, there's a lack of available places to stay, I would guess, if they're not being satisfied. So is there a proper way to control the demand for people coming up, and especially maybe at somewhat a more conducive price point than a newer luxury unit, and also maybe accommodating better to families that want to come up? So there's a lot of different considerations, and I'm glad that we're going to have that discussion. There's a lot of things to think about. Just looking forward, maybe, as Councilmember Rouse said, we're sort of trying to put the genie back in the bottle in the funk zone. Maybe looking forward as a planning commission, one suggestion might start to have conversation on the Haley-Milpas corridor, for example. As that evolves, and that's really a place, assuming AUD is successful, that we'd like to see that development of multifamily or mixed use. And how do you address parking in that area? I believe if you look at the design guidelines for the area, even though it's antiquated and outdated, I think there were some provisions in there for common parking in the district. There were certain blocks that were picked out where primarily public parking could take place. So maybe on our list for the future is try to get ahead of that issue on Haley-Milpas corridor versus trying to react to what happened in the funk zone going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I will, first of all, support staff's prioritization of these 5 work efforts. And I'd like to focus my comments on numbers 2, 3, and 5. So I'll start with the AUD. Obviously, the Planning Commission spends a great deal of time discussing and setting policies around housing. And with the AUD implementation, I think it was a momentous decision for the council to support this. And a couple of years ago, I had a one-on-one with Councilmember Francisco about it, because I know initially, and perhaps even still today, he's not here today, but that he was skeptical about the support of it. But now that it's implemented, he and I agreed that's what's of paramount importance is clear, close, and appropriate implementation along with really good tracking, so that, as you've heard from some of the other commissioners, when it comes time to evaluate the success, we have clear, objective definitions of success, and that whoever is in the decision-making seats on the commission, the council, also in staff, we're all using the same yardstick. And the reason I think primarily that Commissioners Jordan, Campanella, and I self-selected ourselves to be the new subcommittee for AUD success definition is because we've been through this process, especially Mr. Jordan and I have been involved in the final stages of Plan Santa Barbara approval. And this tool, this ordinance could be so important, is that important in helping us carefully but supportively develop the right mix of housing that we so desperately need and in the right neighborhood. So having said that, I want to reference a matrix that staff provided the Planning Commission on January 22nd because we have 15 projects on this list. 2 of the 15 projects are kind of direct AUD-related projects. The remaining 13 are taking advantage of or benefiting from the AUD parameters. So even though we only have 2 official AUD projects on the list, we have many more that are incorporating some of the advantages of this ordinance. And I want to just point out, because when we think of 250 units or 8 years, the 250 units now with the economic recovery are actually coming about at an accelerated rate that we may not have anticipated, the council may not have anticipated in 2011. So, for example, the 2 projects on this list, 604 East Coda and 3885 State Street, they together make up 114 units of 250 units in the test. If we add to that what will be coming online when it's eventually approved, it's the 251 South Hope low-income senior project that the Housing Authority, Garden Court 2, has brought forward to the city. That's 90 units if the proposal is approved as.
To be clear, that's not part of the AUD.
So what will, but I understand, but what will happen is that's going to be another even greater, I think in terms of number of units, project that will be part of this important, I'll say larger test, not just the micro test, but the macro test as to whether or not the parameters and benefits of the AUD project are working in the city. So to that end, I'm very pleased, as you've heard, that we now have a subcommittee and be working closely. I'm looking forward to the council's feedback on setting the test parameters. In terms of the larger discussion about housing, I want to pick up on a couple of comments by some of my colleagues, and that's in terms of the rental housing stock. And I've talked with Mr. Buell, and it's true in past years. Mr. Rouse and I have discussed this as well. And this goes then to sort of dovetails in with the preservation of rental units. On the one hand, I'm very supportive of providing a diverse sort of composition of housing because we are a diverse community. You know, age, socioeconomic, those who work here, those who visit, et cetera. So I really think this is going to be a difficult balancing act for us. Yes, we have students who are transitional residents of the city. They need some place to live, especially those who, by City College's charter, should be attending, if they would so desire, a California community college. At the same time, I think it's unrealistic for us to simply prohibit or outlaw rental units because it comes down to, as always, a compliance issue. And it's on a complaint basis now. So rather than simply prohibiting less than 30-day rentals in residential zones, especially single-family residential zones, I'm currently in favor of staff conducting this additional research, looking at other communities that have put in place ordinances, and I mentioned the San Francisco city-county ordinance that I believe went into effect last November, which I think will be a proactive, kind of rational way to go about examining how other like communities are coping with this issue, where there's an interest in short-term rentals, and at the same time, there are quality of life and neighborhood impacts that need to be proactively addressed. Not to call this out with too bright a line, but I really think that we, the city, are backing ourselves into a corner with taking the transient occupancy tax from those who are not complying with the zoning ordinance and not taking expeditious action, whether it's a new ordinance or it's outlawing this entirely, prohibiting it. So I'm glad that it's on the agenda today, and I think this should be it's number 5. I don't know that number 5 means that it's lower than 1 through 4, but I think it does need to be a priority before such time as is possible, which did happen in San Francisco, which is that the community rose up before the elected officials decided to take action, and then it was significant pressure on the San Francisco city attorney and the Board of Supervisors to take action. So I'd like to see us kind of get out in front so we're not the tail being wagged by the dog, so to speak. Now, in terms of multifamily design guidelines, Planning Commission discussed this to some extent at our offline work session earlier this quarter. And I think it's pretty well recognized that we have kind of a disparate set of different guidelines for different kinds of housing and in different neighborhoods. Whether it all comes under one new set of guidelines, as Commissioner Thompson suggested, which I would be in favor of looking at that, or we simply just try to align and reduce the disconnect between some of the guidelines and modernize them. I think that's important. I'd like to bring forward one thought that I shared in our work session with staff earlier this year, and that is perhaps there are neighborhoods that are no longer as homogeneous or as consistent as they used to be in architectural style and design, and it could be that they've now been in such a great state of transition over a number of years that to to impose sort of a static set of design guidelines may be outdated for us. I don't know exactly where those neighborhoods are. When we looked at the Brosian Way project up near Hope Ranch, this topic arose. And that certainly is a neighborhood that is no longer sort of a gentleman farmer neighborhood. It's been changing for quite some time in terms of the residents, the uses, and the architectural styles. I would be very hard-pressed today to say that there is a uniform or consistent architectural style, for example, in that neighborhood, and I think we have a number of them. So I urge staff to get the support of City Council to provide you with the resources you need to make this a top priority as well, because with each project that comes through the review boards, and some also come to the Commission, we don't have the tools that we need. And I think the review boards desperately need those tools to act in a more consistent and I think modern way in terms of looking at design guidelines. I think that's it for my questions for today. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I can either comment now, or if you'd prefer I do that at the end, I'll come back.
Might as well get the full barrage. And I'll try to, I appreciate that many of the comments made so far I agree with. I'll try to, since we are going to have to be running out of time here somewhere along the line, I'll try and be a little briefer with mine. First of all, the vacation rental. I appreciate that most folks so far have raised that issue. I think we both on vacation rental and on the student housing, we need to have a sense of quantification. It's not just that we are at nearly $1 million in revenue, it's that we were at 100,000 4 years ago. So, i.e., it's been almost 1,000% increase in a very short period of time. So, this is it's a growing issue, and it's one that we need to we're not going to get ahead of it, but at least let's try and catch up with it to some degree. And it's likewise with student housing. How many units are involved, and a little bit of where, but that at least if we can get a sense of those two issues. And I think it was Mr. Jordan that raised the point about worker housing. This is so, it's at the core of, one of the cores of what we're trying to accomplish here is in a fully rounded community is maintaining the able-bodied but not super wealthy person here who's really contributing to the nuts and bolts of our city every day. These other issues, the vacation rental, student housing, obviously feed into that concern as well. The AUD monitoring. If Mr. Jostis were watching this meeting, he's just grinning in glee at the job that you folks, us folks, are headed toward of trying to make this adaptive management into something that's a prescribed task. It isn't yet, and of course, and the way he presented it 8 years ago was, we can do a prescribed task out of this, and it's going to be our job to prescribe it. And it's a fascinating opportunity. It is it is attempting to create an ongoing, real-time feedback loop on these things, and it'll be a set of values in place in these years later that will make a call. How is it doing? And that was, of course, the deal that Ms. Schwartz was alluding to, that we made as a council to say, let's be cautious about this, but let's at least take a step forward. And I appreciate that we've actually we're in the midst of that, and we're seeing a boom that's giving us the opportunity for this to go forward. So it's tough work, but I think this is a great crew that we have to help us come to those understandings. Funk zone. When you think back when the last coastal plan was written, the funk zone, there was this, were there still stop signs or stop lights on 101? I mean, just about then. So that was an isolated, a couple of 100 acres down there that still had squid drying lines and such going on. So times have really changed, and we need, obviously, it's a huge, it's like the Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. All of a sudden, whoa, this thing is just so going off, and we need to put the resources into it. Hopefully there would be some kind of, emergence of a downtown organization, so to speak, down there, some cohesion start to develop. Parking clearly is the operative term. And you think back to State Street 60 years ago, kind of some of those similar thoughts of, individualistic entrepreneurs saying, hey, maybe we can do something collectively together that's going to organize ourselves better and invest in it. And of course, look what we've pulled off. Our predecessors, the people that we inherited the city from, created for us in terms of the downtown, as Mr. Mahan calls it, plaza, but downtown's the State Street. Absolutely critical that those be highest priorities. The bonus density, I won't ask for that explanation, but maybe offline staff can give me a reason of why that's so important that be at the top of the list. I'm going to introduce one last one. I've been doing this with Mr. Casey for a year or two, and that is soft story housing, multi-housing here. Trying to get on board with we see LA City starting to make some real progress here. This is a real danger in our city, as we have a whole lot of multi-family housing which doesn't meet our earthquake safety code, and we need to just start. It's like vacation rental was maybe 10 years ago or whatever. Let's get it on the list. Let's start, even if it's just going to the League of California Cities and looking for state help and all that. Let's not let this issue be a sleeping, and then all of a sudden we have another big earthquake, and we weren't on record as saying we need to be doing something about this on a collective basis. Great discussion today, good staff work, and glad to be here.
Thank you. I agree with staff's priorities, although I wouldn't consider them to be in any priority order because they encompass quite a bit of different levels of work effort. The updating of the bonus density ordinance, I can see the reason for it, and it should be almost pro forma to get that through. When we start talking about zoning standards and multi-unit guidelines, those can be fairly well defined, and there's some significant work effort involved. But some of the others, like preserving rental units, that's sort of a philosophical thing. We all agree with it, but we've got to come up with something more specific to actually implement it. I agree with a lot of what Commissioner Jordan said, and I'm not going to go back over those, but the AUD monitoring, I know that Commissioner Campanella has done a lot of work on looking at that, and I hope that when the committee gets together with staff, we can start implementing that sooner rather than later, because as has been pointed out by several, we're moving forward on AUD projects, but we haven't yet agreed on how we're going to evaluate those projects. So the longer we wait, the more difficult it's going to be to do a comparison with what was compared with what is. And I would add my voice to emphasize what Commissioner Jordan and Councilmember White said regarding middle-class housing. We put a lot of emphasis on helping people at the lower end of the spectrum, but the one that we really need to focus on is the middle level of the spectrum. And the impact from the city college is something that we brought up on the housing element discussion. And as Commissioner Jordan said, it was somewhat watered down when it finally saw the light of day in the housing element. But I think that this is a really significant philosophical difference that's causing an impact on the city. And I say a philosophical difference on the part of the people running the community college. It's no longer a community college when you go around the world and look to recruit students from around the country and around the world. That seems to me to defeat the purpose of a community college, and there's no place for these folks to live other than in the rental housing stock, and it's having a significant impact, and it's something we can't do very much about. I don't know how the council and community college trustees meetings go because you guys have it, and we're not always privy to all of what goes on there. But that's an area that I think really needs to be investigated with the community college trustees and where they're going with this. And finally, I would say on the vacation rentals, I've heard from a lot of people in the community, and I think maybe the staff needs to give us an answer how we can answer the community. How can one branch of the city government be able to go out and find out where some of these vacation rentals are and send them letters saying you need to get a license and pay TOT, when the other branch of the same city government says we don't know where they are and we are only going to wait until somebody complains? I agree that we need to have a long-term policy on how to deal with them. And I'm not sure I would completely agree with Commissioner Jordan saying close them all down right now, but we do know where they are, to at least some of them, not all of them. And if one branch of the government can do that, I don't see why the other branch of the government can't do likewise and send the folks letters saying you're violating the zoning ordinance. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for the presentation today. I would like to know about the bonus density ordinance. I understand from reading the report it has to do with supportive and transitional housing. That if you can give a short explanation today, I would be grateful.
Hold on. Just keep going, Kathy. We'll do that.
Okay. And then in terms of, I see some reference in the report to the adaptive management. I think there's going to be a report in September. And when we reviewed the climate change action plan, there seemed to be a lot of things that were referred to. We're going to keep an eye on it in that monitoring program. And today we talked about sea level rise, and I'm glad to see staff is staying on top of that. I think the public is interested in what we're doing to plan for a global climate disruption. In terms of the funk zone, I was really happy to hear Councilmember Rouse and Ms. Weiss today talking about what I heard was this isn't just about parking. That when is there going to be a master plan process, a scoping of all the businesses down there? The report says the lack of parking in the area and policy constraints related to parking was identified as the biggest limiting factor to new development and redevelopment of the area. Do people want new development and redevelopment down there? I mean, this is what's happening on the east side, where you have to engage the business community to find out what's going on down there. I think there are businesses in the funk zone who like it is. They don't necessarily want to be an art gallery or a winery, and they are still functioning as a commercial or manufacturing operation, even though I think it was in 1997 or whenever it was that the zoning was changed from commercial manufacturing to allow more tourist serving uses down there. There really needs to be a bigger discussion. It's not just about parking. In terms of the vacation rentals, Commissioner Jordan, you had me taking a breath in when you said a cease and desist letter, because I was thinking an amnesty period would be appropriate because the city has been tolerant of the vacation rentals. And I understand that people are making a living off of it. And so we need to give them time to transition to something else. I absolutely do not want vacation rentals in a single family home area. What is next? A McDonald's or some other thing that's really going to push the limits. And I appreciate your comments, Commissioner Lodge, about I like partying in a hot tub too, but if that, it cannot happen, and I know that there's complaints about it. We need to preserve our housing stock. To me, that's more the issue, is protecting the rentals and making sure that someone isn't just making money off of our city. Because what happened, if I'm correct, over time, so it used to be that there were a few vacation rentals here and there, and then somebody realized, hey, I can make a lot of money off of this. And then with Airbnb and other, so people are coming in and they're buying the houses with cash and just making this big business out of it. It's wrong. And I'm glad we're having the discussion. And the City College bond measure kind of did bring all of this bubbling to the surface. City College is not totally to blame for our housing crunch. I'm an avid supporter of their educational mission, but you're right, they're off the tracks with some stuff. And changing their enrollment practices is something I understand has to be done through the state legislature. But we can do something about vacation rentals now. Again, I say amnesty so that people can transition out of that. And no, I don't think whatever the half and half measure is that, in the summer we'll let vacation rentals happen in single family areas. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think, Mr. Rao, did you have anything else you wanted to say before I start?
Not really, just to add that I think the research you're doing on vacation rentals will be really helpful. Some people have already made up their minds, which I think is a mistake. I would like to hear all the choices, and they may be right, they may not be, but let's take a careful look at it. It does affect really many aspects of the community in many different ways.
So thanks for all the comments, and it's clear that the department is very busy with a number of activities. And first thing, when it comes to budget, your budget presentation, I think the council is going to need to know if there's any necessary changes to implement these policies. I'm glad to hear, Ms. Weiss, when you said the extra funds we put in for the plan check and enforcement that actually is working well, because the last thing we want is to be the ones that people are waiting for to move their projects forward. So that was important. So that's a budget question on the side. I appreciate Mr. Rouse talking about how they're all interconnected, and they are. And so, I guess I'll just, without repeating what people have said, my viewpoints on, it was interesting going first with City College. Mr. Thompson, you were saying you don't know what those meetings are like. Well, we've only had two, I think, in the history of the city of Santa Barbara and the history of City College. So, and Mondays was pretty focused on the one issue of the task force recommendations. But I believe and I agree that there are bigger conversations to have. And one of the goals that we agreed to on Monday was to come back in the fall to show what progress is being made on the task force recommendations. And I think that's another opportunity, actually, to bring up some other issues that are coming up as part of those conversations. And dealing with this noise ordinance and other things with City College, we'll see how that goes. One of the other issues that relates to City College housing, not just City College housing, but just in terms of preservation of rentals and the middle class, white collar, working class income housing stock is, and it was put in there very briefly in the report there, but maybe something to think about in the future, is a just eviction ordinance, which the county actually has. And I don't know how well or if it's working or not working. That was mostly in response to Isla Vista and areas where families who lived in apartment units in Isla Vista were basically being evicted out, so the property owner can upgrade the apartments and then charge 3 times the rent to students, basically. So there's a similar, I don't think as pervasive issue happening here, but it is happening. I don't know if that's opening up a whole other Pandora's box, but it is something that I think is worth at least looking to see how the county, they just, I think, adopted that ordinance a few years ago, and what's going on there. I know that's adding to something, but in terms of preserving rental units, it's part of the mix. So there's that. The rental, the vacation rentals, I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been looking at a lot of the other ordinances. I think the City County of San Francisco, as Ms. Schwartz was saying, is one to really look at. I believe also the City of San Luis Obispo recently adopted one. And I want to throw out something I don't think has been brought up yet, but is part of the thinking process. And your outreach and hearing back is going to be very important. We talk about a lot how difficult it is to live and work in Santa Barbara, and how difficult it is to buy a home and be able to live here. And in some cases, so there are two issues to me when it comes to vacation rentals. One is enforcement of good neighbor policies. And I think we have a lot of items on the books. For example, the hot tub issue to me, it doesn't matter if it's someone vacationing for the night or someone who lives in the place. If someone is putting a hot tub within a setback and creating issues with neighbor issues, that needs to be addressed. It doesn't matter if it's a vacation rental or not. And I think we have rules on the books that can help enforce those kind of things. But the other piece is, do we really care? And I guess this is a question that to decide. If an owner-occupied homeowner goes away for a weekend or for a couple of weeks and rents out their place and abides by good neighbor rules for a vacation rental anywhere in the city, I guess that's the question. In some cases, that actually might help people live and work in Santa Barbara and be able to purchase a home because they're getting additional income to pay the mortgage. That, to me, is very different from someone purchasing a single-family home for the sole purpose of a vacation rental, thus taking away the unit itself for a 30-day, for a month-to-month tenancy. So I think that conversation needs to be part of the discussion and looking at, because I think the big broad brush is, who lives here, how can they afford living here, what are the opportunities for a diverse form of housing, and then obviously where in the city does it make a difference, whether in the waterfront area where residential units are intermixed with motels and hotels, is that really an issue or not in terms of vacation rentals, whether it's owner occupied or not? I agree with a lot's been said. We've been contradictory in our approach, and I think it's because we just haven't had the policy discussion yet. And and I think putting vacation rentals on a level playing field with motels and hotels for at least the hotel tax, it seemed to make sense when there was just a few of them, and now we've just risen up to the point where we're at a tipping point and really need to have the discussion. So I believe both the City of San Luis Obispo ordinance and the City County San Francisco one does have that distinction between owner-occupied and not. And there's a way to monitor that through the business license process. You have to do an annual business license. You have to prove that this is your place of primary residence. And then how do you address the issues with good neighbor policies everywhere around the city? So I'd like to throw that thought in the mix there. And then finally on the AUD program monitoring, again, all part of the same conversation. And here's an opportunity. We're looking at bonus rental densities and how do they look? What is the shape of it in the city? And how does that provide those diverse housing options for people who may not want a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a yard somewhere in San Roque? They rather live in a smaller place downtown. And that's what the whole point of the AUD program was about. So I'm glad that we're looking at that because we want to get ahead of when we reach the 250 units. We want to know what the impacts are. And good luck with the funk zone. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So with that, there was a lot of questions and things if you want to wrap up. And I know Mr. Vincent, there might be some answer there too, or Mr. Kalan.
Madam Mayor, members of the Council and Planning Commission, two things I wanted to comment on, and let me begin with the density bonus law. It doesn't apply only to transitional and supportive housing. The density bonus law is another intrusion into local control from Sacramento designed to incentivize the creation of affordable housing. So based on the number of affordable units that are provided, the law allows greater densities than what the base zoning would allow. It also allows two things that are not implicit in the name density bonus. It allows incentives for other incentives from the city and waivers of development standards. So things like parking can be attacked. Parking standards can be attacked through density bonus applications. We'll unfortunately probably have to confront this first in the context of the funk zone. So that's a warning that we will have a difficult time maintaining local control when density bonus applications come in. The second thing I wanted to comment on is vacation rentals. I have about 6 to 9% of my budget devoted to code enforcement, and that is the only area of the budget where I have policy control. The reason I have policy control is that it's not ethical for a prosecutor to take direction from elected or appointed officials on how to use their prosecutorial discretion. With vacation rentals, the policy that I have discussed with Mr. Casey, Mr. Samario, and developed is that when we are asked to seek recompense for transient occupancy tax that hasn't been paid, we will also prosecute zoning violations. In other words, we will not simply go forward and collect transient occupancy tax against an illegal unit. I don't need to make that decision for transient uses that are paying their tax and not creating a financial problem. But when the two issues are presented together, I feel an ethical obligation to prosecute both. I will let you know that the issue is hot. There are referrals in my office now for prosecution on vacation rentals. And in the absence of some prompt council legislative action, I really don't have much choice but to go forward with those. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Question. How many do you have, are you considering now regarding the vacation rentals prosecuted?
Finance initially identified about 19 cases. We have about 6 of those pending in my office now.
And are those new, recent, or have they been there a while?
They are after the first of the year of 2015.
Pretty new then, thank you.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to also add some comments with respect to the bonus density ordinance priority. We had it up there, and by the way, they're not in any order. But the reason we had that one up there is because we are, as the city attorney indicated, out of compliance. And in order for our housing element to have been considered for certification, we need to have that. We currently in our ordinance do refer back to state law, so we were, okay with respect to that. But in terms of updating it in order to have the right percentages, if that's the way we want to, proceed with that, we need to do that. The transitional and supportive housing would be piggybacked on that particular work effort because, again, we have to provide the definitions per state law definitions in our ordinance. So that's what would happen as part of that work effort.
Thank you. And thank you all for your comments and questions and suggestions. This is always a good work session. And as Ms. Unsueta said, those 5 priority items we identified are in no particular order. If we just listed them as items we think we might be able to complete within the next 5 years, and they will involve different sections within the division, other city staff as well. And we hope to some extent some consultant resources. So some of them would be probably going on at the same time as we try to carry them all out. I did want to respond or just provide some more information on a couple points I heard. I guess I'll start first with AUD monitoring. And also just a point of clarification, because this is often confused or misstated in the community, that what the AUD or average unit size density incentive program is a temporary replacement of the variable density program. And so if someone's developing their property and they're not using base density or the density allowed by the zone, they will use AUD. So when we talk about AUD projects, it can be somewhat confusing when I think what many people are actually referring to are those in the high density areas or priority housing overlay that are subject to that test, the 250 unit test or 8-year period. So just want to clarify there. We are working on further developing an AUD webpage on the Planning Central website, and Commissioner Campanella has been very helpful in suggesting how to enhance that, and we will work on doing that as well. One thing that's of utmost importance on that page is to periodically update the community on how many units we have in the pipeline that would count towards that test. So we're giving them feedback where we stand in potentially reaching the 250 certificates of occupancy. And we will, AUD monitoring, we will be addressing that in more detail in the fall in the joint work session when we bring to you the adaptive management program. That'll be one component of it. So we do have some work to do in terms of AUD monitoring. We do, at this point, because we've just had 2 projects that have received approval that actually would count towards that test, we do have conditions on those projects that they will provide to us an annual survey of residents that hit 8 data points, and it has to do with their amount of rent they're paying or the purchase price for the unit, in what zip code do they work, how many bedrooms are in the unit. So a couple quantitative data points that we're collecting, but what we are hearing and what's also important is the qualitative data points, and so that's where we have some more work to do that quality of life monitoring. So let's see, I think that covers the AUD comments. Coordination with Santa Barbara City College. Staff does periodically coordinate with City College on major projects that they might have on their campus. We are also going to meet with them very soon to talk with them about our LCP update. We do comment on their long-range development plan that they have to submit to the Coastal Commission. So there is interaction among staff and City College staff in that regard. Also, have very recently heard of some efforts that City College is making to try to partner with some developers to maybe, although might not involve developing housing units, but partnering with existing housing managers to potentially provide some student housing. So I'm very hopeful we might have some good news to report in that regard in the future. And then lastly, Funk Zone. We have, in response to property owners and business owners reaching out to us, we have been engaged with them, as Ms. Weiss said, to help try to advise them, direct them to organize among themselves to form a district to decide how they might best be able to address their parking issues. But as Councilmember Murillo stated, that's only one side of the conversation. In order to actually engage in a master plan, as it was referred to, for Funk Zone parking development standards, we need to engage with more of the community, because that is just one perspective we've heard from at this point. But the question is, do we want to facilitate additional development in the Funk Zone? How and what would be the consequences of potentially, freeing up what is now somewhat of a constraint for development in the Funk Zone? So we just want to let you know we are aware of that it's definitely worthy of a larger community discussion. And I think that's all I had in response. So any other questions?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. May I talk to a subject which was briefly mentioned by one other commissioner that I did not bring up? There was some talk about the design guidelines and the various sets that we have, and I recently went through them, and they almost all refer to Santa Barbara's distinctive built environment, to encourage the preservation of pre-1925 and Hispanic styles of architecture. This is ABR guidelines, not HLC. Urban design guidelines must be compatible with Santa Barbara's distinctive architectural character. Single-family design review board, protect historic and architectural qualities of Santa Barbara. Upper State Street, enhance Santa Barbara's distinctive built environment. For El Pueblo Viejo, the city of Santa Barbara, of course the same things, but the city of Santa Barbara's enjoyed a reputation for its distinctive architectural character. It has created an internationally recognized sense of place, and it is part of what attracts visitors here. I mean, it is what makes Santa Barbara distinctive, and I think it is very important that it be preserved. About 20 years ago, a distinguished architect in town sent a letter to the news press saying that, protesting the EPV regulations, they were too restrictive, stifled creativity. There are only 2 buildings of excellence in EPV, the courthouse and the Arlington. Well, I wrote back a letter and pointed out that architects can and do design in any style they wish outside El Pueblo Viejo. Pray tell me, where are the buildings of excellence outside of El Pueblo Viejo? There was no answer. There aren't any. And we're getting, with all of that, we're getting buildings approved like this. It was appealed to the council, and I know you like to support your boards, but I think sometimes I urge you not to.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Mr. Thompson?
Just briefly for the planning commissioners, please pick up your documents for next week on the side table when you go out.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're adjourned.